Open your Bible to the very end of the Old Testament. You will find the book of Malachi, closing with an ancient promise of a coming messenger by pagan empires. It was created by the very family who saved the Jewish religion. The story begins with a pile of broken stones. They celebrated their expanding borders and their growing military might. But forcing a covenant upon a captive audience is not an act of holiness. It is an act of supreme political arrogance. And this specific decision planted a slow-growing, poisonous seed that would eventually annihilate the Hasmonean bloodline entirely. By forcing the Idumeans to become Jewish citizens, John Hyrcanus brought a specific family into the political fold of Judea. This Idumean family was wealthy, shrewd, and deeply resentful of the kings who had conquered them. Generations later, a descendant of this forced conversion would realize that, because he was now technically considered a Jew, he could make a legal claim to the throne of Judea. His name was Herod. The Hasmoneans had unwittingly created the monster that would one day consume them. But the Idumean threat was still decades away from taking power, long before Herod seized the crown. The Hasmonean dynasty would begin to cannibalize itself. The external wars of conquest were brutal, but they were nothing compared to the blood that was about to run down the streets inside Jerusalem. The most chilling moments in history often happened during a celebration. By the time Alexander Jannaeus inherited the Hasmonean throne in 103 BC, in the winter of 164 BC, a family of Jewish rebels achieved the impossible. The Maccabees, led by a fierce guerrilla warrior named Judas, recaptured the city of Jerusalem. The Maccabean zeal for God had completely vanished. Jannaeus was a ruthless warlord who spent his reign expanding his territory, plundering cities, and amassing wealth. Yet, he still wore the sacred garments. He was still the high priest of Israel. One autumn, during the Feast of Tabernacles, Jannaeus stood before the altar in Jerusalem to perform the sacred water libation. The temple courts were packed with Jewish pilgrims. In their hands, they held palm branches and the etrog, a bright yellow citrus fruit used for the festival. But the people were furious. They looked at the man at the altar and did not see a holy servant of God. They saw a corrupted, blood-stained tyrant who had polluted the priesthood. As Jannaeus prepared the sacrifice, the crowd revolted. They began pelting the high priest with their citrus fruits. They screamed insults, mocking his lineage and declaring him unfit to stand before the altar. Jannaeus did not respond with repentance. He responded with the sword. He unleashed his hired foreign mercenaries directly into the packed temple courts. Before the sun set, 6,000 Jewish worshippers had been slaughtered on the Holy Mount. Their blood ran over the pavement and pooled at the base of the altar. That massacre ignited a catastrophic 6-year civil war inside Judea. Over 50,000 Jewish citizens were killed. The strict religious purists, the theological ancestors of the New Testament Pharisees, were so desperate to remove the corrupt Hasmonean king from a Greek tyrant named Antiochus Epiphanes. When the Jewish fighters finally walked into the temple courts, the scene was a nightmare. That they actually invited a Syrian army to help them fight him. The Jewish people were now aligning with the very empire their grandfathers had originally expelled. Eventually, Alexander Jannaeus crushed the rebellion. What he did next remains one of the darkest atrocities in ancient Jewish history. He captured 800 leaders of the rebellion and brought them to the center of Jerusalem. He ordered all 800 men to be crucified. While they hung suffocating on the wooden crosses, Jannaeus ordered their wives and children to be dragged out and slaughtered before their dying eyes. And while the blood of his own people soaked into the dust, the high priest set up luxurious tents facing the crosses and hosted a massive feast with his concubines, drinking wine as his theological opponents died. This horrifying event changes entirely how we read the New Testament. When we open the Gospels, we immediately meet the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because we do not know the history of the blank page. We often imagine these groups as simple religious academics, arguing over obscure points of the law in quiet synagogues. The reality is far darker. The Sadducees were heavily aligned with the wealthy, aristocratic priestly class that survived within the Hasmonean power structure. The Pharisees were the traumatized ideological descendants of the men who hung on those 800 crosses. When you see the Pharisees in the Gospels aggressively enforcing every tiny detail of the law, the sacred altar of God had been intentionally defiled. Swine had been slaughtered upon it. The cold air still carried the scent of pagan sacrifices, demanding absolute separation from the culture, and fiercely guarding their traditions. You are not merely looking at blind legalism. You are looking at a profound trauma response. They had learned the hard way what happens when the priesthood is compromised. They believed that cultural assimilation had caused the slaughter of their grandfathers, and they swore it would never happen again. The nation was bleeding out from within. The Hasmonean dynasty had turned Jerusalem into a slaughterhouse, leaving the Jewish people exhausted, fractured, and terrified of their own leaders. A massive power vacuum was opening. And when brothers fight over a throne, they usually invite a monster into the house. The final collapse of Jewish independence did not begin with a conquering army marching across the horizon. It began with an invitation. By the year 63 BC, the Hasmonean dynasty had descended into absolute dysfunction. Two brothers, Aristobulus Aku and Hyrcanus Aku, were locked in a bitter, exhausting civil war over who would inherit the throne and the high priesthood. The streets of Jerusalem were once again divided, and neither brother could secure a decisive victory. So, in an act of breathtaking political blindness, they looked outside their borders for a referee. The Roman general, Pompey the Great, was stationed in Damascus, expanding the reach of the Republic. Both Hasmonean brothers sent emissaries to the Roman camp. They carried massive bribes of gold, and the holy place was utterly desecrated. The rebels faced a profound theological crisis. The altar was polluted, but the stones themselves had once been holy, each begging Pompey to intervene, choose a side, and declare who was the rightful king of the Jews. But you do not ask a wolf to mediate a dispute over a flock of sheep. Pompey saw exactly what this was, an open door into Judea. He marched his legions south toward Jerusalem. When he arrived, the supporters of Aristobulus barricaded themselves inside the fortified Temple Mount and refused to surrender. The Roman response was methodical and merciless. For 3 months, the heavy thud of Roman battering rams echoed through the valleys of Jerusalem. Finally, the walls were breached, and the legions poured into the sacred courts. The historical accounts of that day are staggering. As Roman steel tore through the temple complex, the Jewish priests refused to abandon their posts. They continued pouring the daily libations and offering the sacrifices, even as the Roman soldiers cut them down at the altar. The blood of the priests literally mixed with the blood of the sacrifices. 12,000 Jewish defenders were slaughtered. Then, Pompey did the unthinkable. Covered in the dust and blood of the siege, the Roman general walked past the bronze altar, climbed the steps of the sanctuary, and pulled back the heavy veil. He stepped directly into the Holy of Holies, the sacred, dark room, where only the high priest was permitted to enter, and only once a year. Exactly 100 years earlier, Judas Maccabeus had cleansed this very space. You cannot simply throw sacred stones into the city refuse pile, but you also cannot offer holy sacrifices on a defiled surface. From pagan defilement. Now, his own family had invited a pagan general to walk right into it. Pompey looked around the quiet room, fully expecting to find a massive, golden statue of the Jewish god. Instead, he found nothing, baffled by a religion with no physical idol. He walked out. He left the temple treasury untouched. But the spiritual devastation of his presence was absolute. This is the profound tragedy of the missing century. The Jewish people did not lose their independence because the Roman Empire was an unstoppable juggernaut that sought out the biblical faith to destroy it. They lost their independence because two Jewish brothers cared more about sitting on a throne than protecting the sanctuary of God. The Hasmonean ambition had completely destroyed the very freedom their ancestors had bled in the caves to secure. Pompey stripped the Hasmoneans of their royal title. He allowed Hyrcanus to remain as a puppet high priest. But Judea was now a tributary of Rome. The crown had officially fallen from the family line. The royal dynasty was broken. But the Hasmonean brothers had left the door to the throne room wide open. And waiting in the shadows was a ruthless opportunist, ready to step over the wreckage and claim the power for himself. The stage was finally set for the villain of the Christmas story. When you open the second chapter of Matthew, you meet a king trembling in the dark. They made a temporary decision. According to the ancient historical record of 1st Maccabees, the priests tore down the altar. Herod the Great is pacing the floors of Jerusalem, terrified by a rumor brought by foreign astrologers. They are asking a very specific question. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? To understand why that single sentence unleashed a massacre in Bethlehem, you have to remember the forced conversions of the missing century. Decades earlier, the Hasmonean priest king John Hyrcanus had marched south and forced the Idumeans to convert to Judaism at the edge of a sword. It was an act of brutal political assimilation. But that decision brought a wealthy, ambitious Idumean family into the political fold of Judea. When the Roman general Pompey invaded Jerusalem, an Idumean politician named Antipater saw an opportunity. He aggressively aligned himself with Rome, proving so useful to the empire that Julius Caesar eventually appointed him as the chief minister of Judea. Antipater had a brilliant, ruthless son. His name was Herod. By Trigestiscedum BC, with the backing of the Roman legions, Herod captured Jerusalem and claimed the title King of the Jews. But Herod had a massive problem. He was an Idumean, a descendant of Edom. To the Jewish people, he was a half-Jew, a Roman puppet sitting on a stolen throne. He knew the people hated him. They carried the heavy, blood-stained stones to a convenient place on the Temple Mount, and they laid them in a pile. He also knew that despite all their corruption and cruelty, the people still romanticized the ancient Hasmonean bloodline. So Herod made a calculated decision. To legitimize his rule, he married a stunningly beautiful Hasmonean princess named Mariamne. He hoped that by merging his family with the royal blood of the Maccabees, the Jewish people would finally accept him. Instead, the marriage drove him insane. Herod knew that any male relative of his wife had a stronger historical claim to the throne than he did. His paranoia became a terrifying, consuming fire. He began a systematic extermination of his own wife's family. He appointed Mariamne's teenage brother as high priest. But when the crowds cheered too loudly for the young Hasmonean boy at the temple, Herod had him quietly drowned in a swimming pool in Jericho. He executed Mariamne's grandfather. He executed her mother. Eventually, consumed by jealousy and political terror, Herod ordered the execution of Mariamne herself. The blood did not stop there. Years later, terrified that his own children might claim their mother's royal Hasmonean heritage and overthrow him, Herod strangled 2 of his own sons. The Roman Emperor Augustus reportedly joked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. This is the violent, blood-soaked psychology. You must understand, when you read the Christmas story, when the Magi arrive in Jerusalem asking about a newborn king, Herod does not hear. They decided to leave them there until a prophet should come to decide what to do with them. Those stones would sit waiting in the shadow. A gentle theological prophecy. He hears the one thing he has spent his entire adult life trying to murder, a legitimate heir to the throne. The slaughter of the innocent infants in Bethlehem was not an isolated burst of madness. It was the paranoid climax of a fake king, who had already exterminated an entire dynasty to protect his stolen crown. The people of Judea were trapped. A Roman puppet sat on the throne, his hands covered in the blood of his own family. The high priesthood was no longer a sacred calling, it was a political office purchased with bribes. The religious purists, the Pharisees, had retreated into a strict, defensive legalism, traumatized by the violence of their own past leaders. The nation was spiritually exhausted. They were desperate for a Messiah. They wanted God to tear open the sky and send a new hammer to shatter Rome. But the people were terrified of what a political king might actually do, because they remembered what the Hasmoneans had done. What kind of king were they actually waiting for? And this brings us back to the stones waiting in the temple. When John the Baptist finally stepped out of the Judean wilderness to announce the coming of the Lord, he did not speak into a theological void. He spoke into a trauma ward. The Jewish people had just survived a century of profound spiritual whiplash of the temple for a very long time. The Maccabees built a new altar, cleansed the sanctuary, and celebrated the 8-day festival we now know as Hanukkah. They had watched their greatest heroes transform into their most brutal tyrants. They had seen their high priests become warlords. They had watched their own brothers crucify them, only to have the surviving factions invite a pagan empire to rule over them. And now, they were suffocating under the paranoia of Herod and the taxation of Rome. This is the exhausted, bleeding world that opens the New Testament. When you understand this history, the gospel narratives suddenly ignite with a new, desperate tension. The people were waiting for the Messiah. But what kind of Messiah did they actually want? They wanted a new Judas Maccabeus. They wanted a new hammer. They were looking for a fierce military deliverer who would ride into Jerusalem, cleanse the temple of the corrupt Sadducees, expel the Roman legions, and take the throne of David by force. But deep down, the memory of the Hasmoneans haunted them. The people wanted a military king. But they had already seen exactly what happens when you try to force the kingdom of God, using the weapons of the world. A crown secured by the sword always requires more blood to keep it. The Hasmonean dynasty had proven that when you fight an empire on its own terms, you inevitably become the very empire you defeated. Turn one single physical page, and you immediately arrive at the Gospel of Matthew. In almost every printed Bible in the world, that page in between is completely blank. At that moment, they were the undisputed heroes of the faith. They had defended the borders of biblical law. This is the hidden context behind the most confusing moments of Jesus' ministry. It explains why Jesus was so frustrating and ultimately offensive to the expectations of his day. In the Gospel of John, after Jesus miraculously feeds the 5,000, the crowd realizes he has the logistical power to supply a massive army. They immediately surge forward to take him by force and make him king. What does Jesus do? He withdraws alone to a mountain. He absolutely refuses to take the crown on their terms. Later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the guards come to arrest Jesus, Peter draws a sword and strikes a servant. In Peter's mind, this is the heroic moment. This is exactly what the priest Mattathias did centuries earlier when he struck down the Greek officer and sparked the Maccabean revolt. Peter thinks he is starting the next holy war. But Jesus rebukes him. Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Jesus completely rejects the Hasmonean template. He knows that you cannot defeat Rome by becoming a Jewish version of Rome. Fighting violence with violence only produces more graves. Even earlier, in the wilderness, when Satan offers Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, if he will only bow down, they had refused to compromise with an empire that wanted to erase their identity. But this is not ultimately a story about fighting off foreign oppression. We are watching a historical replay. That was the exact temptation the Maccabean descendants accepted. The Hasmoneans bowed to political ambition, and it destroyed their souls. Jesus refuses the power of the sword, choosing instead the path of suffering. This is not ultimately a story about replacing a bad earthly king with a better earthly king. It is a story about a completely different kind of kingdom. The central question of the first century was no longer who would take the throne. The question was how the deep spiritual damage of the missing century could possibly be healed. How do you cleanse a nation that has been polluted by its own priests? And that leads us back to the problem of the altar. For more than a century, a pile of heavy, broken stones sat in the cold shadows of the Temple Mount. When the Maccabees first tore down the defiled altar in 164 BC, they carefully stacked those sacred, blood-stained blocks in a quiet corner. The ancient record states they left them there until a prophet should come to decide what to do with them. Those stones waded through it all. They sat silently while Simon Thassi unlawfully merged the crown and the priesthood, corrupting the biblical boundaries of power. They remained in the shadows while John Hyrcanus forced conversions upon the Idumeans at the edge of a sword. It is a story about the inevitable corruption that occurs when humans try to force the kingdom of God using the weapons of the world. They witness the brutal high priest Alexander Jannaeus crucify 800 of his own citizens. The blood of the Pharisees pooling just yards from where they rested. They were there when Pompey's Roman legions slaughtered the priests at the altar. And they were still there when Herod the Great paced his palace, descending into murderous paranoia to protect his stolen throne. For generations, the traumatized people of Judea believed that when the great prophet finally arrived, he would look at those waiting stones and tell them how to build a new earthly altar. They believed he would authorize a new holy war, raise a new army, crush the Roman occupation, and restore the royal dynasty. But then, the prophet actually stepped into the temple courts. Jesus of Nazareth, the rightful king from the line of David, and the eternal high priest, arrived to answer the central question of the missing century. Yet, he did not point to the pile of stones and demand the construction of a better physical altar. He did not ask for a sword. Instead, he stood in the center of the corrupted, heavily guarded temple system and made a shocking declaration: "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." God did not answer the violent ambition of the Hasmoneans by sending a better political dynasty. He answered it by ending the need for human priest-kings entirely. The Hasmoneans had tried to save the nation by sacrificing their enemies. Over the next century, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those righteous rebels would establish the Hasmonean dynasty. They would take the crown. Jesus saved the world by becoming the sacrifice himself. This dark century of history is a mirror. It is remarkably easy to look back at the Hasmonean family and judge their ruthless thirst for power. But how often do you attempt the exact same thing? When you face a season of deep uncertainty or a threat to your security, what do you reach for? What are you trying to force into existence? We all have a profound tendency to take the promises of God and try to secure them using our own strength, our own manipulation, and our own frantic need for control. We want the kingdom, but we want to build it with the weapons of the world. But this is not ultimately a story about our desperate attempts to control our circumstances. It is a story about the devastating grace of a God who refused to participate in our violence. When humanity turned religion into a weapon for empire, God did not respond with a heavier hammer. He responded with a cross. He did not come to claim a throne by shedding the blood of his rivals. He came to surrender his own. The ancient stones never needed to be rebuilt. The final sacrifice had already arrived. They would forcibly convert their neighbors at the edge of a sword. They would crucify their own citizens by the hundreds, and their insatiable thirst for power would eventually invite the Roman Empire directly into the Holy of Holies. If the Maccabees were the ultimate heroes of the biblical world, how did their descendants become its greatest villains? To understand the spectacular collapse of this family, and to understand the corrupted, exhausted world they built for Jesus to inherit, we have to look closely at the height of their power. We have to remember the swing of the hammer. To understand how deeply this family corrupted the world of the New Testament, you must first understand the height of their heroism. For generations, readers have called this historical gap the 400 silent years. We tend to imagine a quiet, peaceful intermission. The Greek Empire of the 2nd century BC did not originally want to annihilate the Jewish people physically. It wanted to absorb them culturally. The ruler of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus IV, gave himself the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. But when the Jewish people resisted his cultural influence, his frustration turned into a campaign of terror. In 160 BC, Antiochus decided that Jewish distinctiveness was an intolerable threat. He issued a decree that effectively outlawed the biblical faith. Observing the Sabbath became a capital offense. Owning a scroll of the Torah was punishable by death. Mothers who circumcised their infant sons were thrown from the city walls. To finalize this forced assimilation, Antiochus set up an altar to Zeus inside the Jewish temple and slaughtered swine on the sacred courts. He expected the Jews to simply surrender and fade into the Greek world. Instead, he ignited a holy war. The spark was struck in a small village called Modin. Greek soldiers arrived and demanded that an elderly Jewish priest named Mattathias offer a pagan sacrifice. Mattathias refused. When another Jewish man stepped forward to compromise and offer the sacrifice, Mattathias drew a weapon. He struck the compromising man down, killed the Greek officer, and tore down the pagan altar. He shouted into the street, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law." We assume the prophets simply stopped speaking. The curtain temporarily closed on biblical history, and the people of Israel sat quietly in the dark, waiting patiently. And supports the covenant, "Come out with me." Mattathias and his 5 sons fled into the Judean hills. The revolt had begun. When Mattathias died, military leadership passed to his son Judas. Judas was a tactical genius who earned the nickname Maccabees, an Aramaic word meaning the hammer. The Maccabean forces were vastly outnumbered. They were a ragtag militia of farmers and priests facing a highly trained, heavily armored Greek war machine, equipped with battle elephants. But they fought with an intense, desperate zeal. They hid in the cold caves of the wilderness. They launched surprise attacks in the narrow mountain passes. They believed that God was fighting for them. And against all military logic, the hammer began to break the empire. By 164 BC, Judas and his men fought their way back into Jerusalem. They found the temple abandoned, its gates burned, and the courts overgrown with weeds. They mourned the desecration, carefully dismantled the defiled altar stones, built a new altar, and lit the sacred lamps. This rededication of the temple became the festival of Hanukkah. At this moment in history, the Maccabees were pure in their motives. Their rebellion was strictly about religious survival, not political domination. They did not want to build a rival empire. They only wanted the freedom to obey God, to read the Torah without facing execution, for the Star of Bethlehem to rise. But that blank page is a lie. If you could actually listen to that single sheet of paper, you would not hear silence. And to keep the covenant. They were defenders, not conquerors. Judas died in battle a few years later, remembered as a legendary hero, who gave his life for the faith. If the story had ended there, the Maccabees would be remembered only as the unblemished saviors of Judaism. The victory was secured, and the biblical faith was preserved. But survival has a way of changing people, and success is often far more dangerous to the human soul than persecution. The surviving brothers of Judas looked around and realized that they no longer merely had religious freedom, they had military power, and the family who saved the religion was about to make a fatal decision. The shift from religious zeal to political ambition did not begin with a sword. It began with a change of clothes. The garments of the high priest were sacred, woven of fine linen, blue yarn, and gold. They were designed for a servant of the altar, a man who represented the people before God in humility and fear. They were never meant to be worn beneath the heavy cloak of a military commander. But by 141 BC, the original Maccabean brothers had fallen in battle, leaving only one surviving son of Mattathias, Simon Thassi. Under Simon's leadership, the Jewish people finally secured full political independence from the Syrian Greeks. The yoke of the empire was entirely broken. You would hear the sound of clashing iron, of tearing garments, of thousands of crucifixions, and of brother murdering brother inside the walls of Jerusalem. Ingratitude. A great assembly of priests, military leaders, and citizens gathered in Jerusalem. They inscribed their decree on heavy bronze tablets and mounted them prominently on Mount Zion. They declared that Simon should be their commander and their high priest forever, until a trustworthy prophet should arise. With that single decree, the Maccabean rebellion officially became the Hasmonean dynasty. And in that same moment, a profound biblical boundary was shattered. To understand why this was so dangerous, we have to look back at the architecture of the Old Testament. In ancient Israel, God carefully divided power. The throne belonged exclusively to the tribe of Judah, specifically to the descendants of David. The priesthood belonged exclusively to the tribe of Levi, specifically to the descendants of Aaron. The crown and the ephod were kept strictly apart, This separation was entirely intentional. The prophets understood that human hearts cannot handle absolute authority. If a king became a tyrant, the high priest was there to represent the law of God. If the priesthood became corrupt, the king could reform the temple. But Simon and his family were priests. They were Levites. They had the biblical right to serve at the altar. But they had absolutely no biblical right to rule as monarchs. Yet, Simon took both roles. The Hasmoneans consolidated the political power of a prince and the religious authority of a high priest into one single throne. They became priest kings. When Jesus arrives in the 1st century, he steps into a world defined by violent religious factions, crushing Roman taxation, and a paranoid, half-Jewish king named Herod. The problem is not that the Hasmoneans were unqualified leaders. The problem is that by combining absolute political power with absolute religious authority, they eliminated any possibility of accountability. Who corrects the high priest when he is also the commander of the army? Who challenges the king when he is the one offering the sacrifices for the nation's sins? The strict religious purists, who had originally fought alongside the Maccabees, watched this power grab in horror. These devout men, known as the Hasidians, had bled in the caves and the mountain passes, but they fought to protect the Torah, not to crown a Levite. When they saw the Hasmoneans claim the supreme authority without the voice of a prophet, many of them walked away in protest. This bitter fracture was the early origin of the religious factions that would later dominate the New Testament. The stones of the defiled altar still sat in their pile, waiting for a true prophet. But the Hasmoneans were no longer waiting. They had the power. They had the priesthood. And they had the army. This is the fatal combination. Whenever religious authority is used to wield military power, the faith is instantly compromised. The Hasmoneans had saved Judaism from external destruction, but they had just infected it with an internal disease. What happens when a high priest decides he wants to act like a pagan emperor, who is obsessed with exterminating his rivals? None of those things existed at the close of the Old Testament. To understand the New Testament, the family that had fought so desperately to defend the borders of Israel suddenly realized they had the military strength to do something else entirely. The defenders of the borders soon became the expanders of the borders. History offers a tragic and predictable pattern. Those who are severely oppressed often become the most brutal oppressors the moment they gain power. The Hasmoneans were no exception. Within a single generation, the family that had fought a desperate, bloody guerrilla war to survive forced assimilation turned around and inflicted it upon their neighbors. Simon Thassi was succeeded by his son, John Hyrcanus, and later by his grandson, Aristobulus. Under their leadership, the Hasmonean state was no longer a small, vulnerable province fighting for its religious life. It became an aggressive, expansionist empire. They hired foreign mercenaries, the very kind of soldiers their grandfather Judas had fought against, and began to conquer the surrounding territories. They looked at the ancient maps and decided they would restore the borders to match the golden era of King Solomon. They marched into Samaria and destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. Then, they marched south into a dry, rocky region called Idumea. Idumea was the Greek name for Edom, the ancient territory belonging to the descendants of Esau. You have to understand where all of this blood came from. The most shocking detail of all is that the violence of the 1st century was not primarily created. The Edomites and the Israelites had a long, bitter biblical history of hostility. But when John Hyrcanus conquered the Idumean cities in the late 2nd century BC, he did not merely demand their political submission. He did not simply extract taxes from their villages or tear down their fortresses. As the reigning high priest of Israel, he issued a terrifying ultimatum. He gave the Idumeans a choice. They must either abandon their ancestral homes and face permanent exile, or they must convert to Judaism, submit entirely to the laws of the Torah, and have every male among them circumcised. This was an unprecedented moment in Jewish history. The covenant of Abraham was designed to be a relationship of faith, chosen by the people and welcomed by foreigners who genuinely wished to join themselves to the God of Israel. It was never meant to be weaponized. But the Hasmonean priest-kings had so thoroughly blended military dominance with religious identity that they saw no difference between conquering a territory and converting a soul. At the edge of a sword, the Idumeans submitted. They were forcibly circumcised and legally absorbed into the Jewish state. The persecuted had become the persecutors. The family that once defied a Greek tyrant for trying to force a foreign religion upon them was now forcing their own religion upon a defeated enemy. The Hasmoneans believed this aggressive assimilation made their nation stronger.